My name is Julia, I'm 33. And for 7 years I saved every extra dollar to finally buy a condo of my own. I thought Christmas would be the time to share that joy with my family, but instead, I found myself sitting at the dinner table, listening to whispers I was never meant to hear. My parents and my sister were already making plans for her family to move into my new home, as if it were theirs, dividing up bedrooms and talking about curtains while I sat there pretending to smile. That night I stayed quiet, but I knew something had changed forever. What would you do if your biggest dream suddenly became everyone else's expectation? Stay with me, because what happened next still shocks me when I think about it. Let me take you back to where it began. My name is Julia, I'm 33, and for 7 years I saved every extra dollar to finally buy a condo of my own. I thought Christmas would be the time to share that joy with my family, but instead I found myself sitting at the dinner table, listening to whispers I was never meant to hear. My parents and my sister were already making plans for her family to move into my new home, as if it were theirs, dividing up bedrooms and talking about curtains while I sat there pretending to smile. That night I stayed quiet, but I knew something had changed forever. What would you do if your biggest dream suddenly became everyone else's expectation? Stay with me, because what happened next still shocks me when I think about it. But before that Christmas night turned everything upside down, let me take you back to the moment when it all began, the day I finally held the keys in my hand. I was 33 when I finally held the keys to something I had dreamed about since my early 20s. The condo was mine, not rented, not borrowed, not promised, but truly mine. I had spent 7 years living carefully, budgeting every expense, packing lunches for work, and skipping vacations that my colleagues bragged about. While friends posted photos from Cancun or Paris, I stayed in Boston calculating compound interest on my savings account and telling myself that one day it would be worth it. That day arrived in the summer of 2023. I remember walking into the glass lobby of the Seaport District building, signing the last stack of paperwork, and hearing the crisp click of the pen. The attorney slid the keys across the table and my fingers trembled as I picked them up. The weight of the keys felt heavier than metal. It felt like independent security and proof that my sacrifices had meant something. I drove to the building with my windows rolled down, the harbor air rushing in. When I stepped inside the unit, sunlight poured through the wide windows overlooking the water. The kitchen had sleek marble counters, the kind I used to cut out from magazines and tape onto my vision board. The 2 bedrooms were empty and echoing, but I could already picture how I would paint the walls a soft cream and put a bookshelf near the corner window. I set my bag on the counter and walked barefoot across the hardwood floors, the sound of my steps bouncing back at me. I whispered to myself almost like a prayer, "This is mine. No one can take this from me." For hours I wandered from room to room, opening cabinets, checking closets, running my hands along the cool surfaces. I even leaned against the balcony rail, staring out at the sailboats, feeling like I was finally part of the city instead of a visitor living paycheck to paycheck. The first night I didn't even bring furniture. I spread a blanket on the living room floor, ordered a pizza, and ate it cross-legged while the lights from the harbor blinked outside. It was quiet except for the hum of the fridge. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for my life to start. I kept the purchase quiet. My parents, Frank and Martha, had a way of turning my achievements into obligations. Whenever I had a promotion, they quickly reminded me that Rachel, my younger sister, could use extra help. Whenever I saved money, they suggested I buy gifts for my nieces and nephew because Rachel had more important bills. So this time I wanted to breathe in the victory before anyone else could twist it into something it wasn't. At work, I continued my routine as if nothing had changed. I wore the same blazers, carried the same worn leather bag, and still packed homemade salads. Only I knew that every evening, instead of returning to the cramped apartment I had rented for years, I was driving to my new condo. I invited only my closest friend Taylor, who worked as a real estate attorney, to see it. She walked in, took one look at the view, and whistled. "You did it, Jules," she said, spinning slowly in the living room. "You actually did it." I laughed, giddy. I kept running around showing her all the details, the pantry shelves, the laundry, tucked in a closet, the sleek shower. We ended up ordering takeout Thai food, eating it on the floor with the pizza box from the night before still in the corner. By the end of that week, I had moved in a few essentials, but not too much. A bed, a couch, a few dishes. I didn't rush the decorating. I wanted to enjoy the process of imagining, planning, building a space that reflected me. Sometimes on weekends, I sat by the window with coffee and watched families walking along the harbor. I thought about how long I had carried the label of the responsible one, the one who had to sacrifice so her sister could get a softer landing. I thought about all the years I was told family comes first, which usually meant Rachel comes first. Sitting there in my own place, I realized maybe it was finally time to put myself first. The condo became a secret treasure, something that existed outside the family's expectations. I even told my parents I was still at the old apartment, and they believed me easily enough. Rachel never asked about my living situation, too busy with her kids and her own financial struggles. It felt almost too easy to hide, but I knew that if word ever got out, they would find a way to make it about her needs instead of my accomplishment. One evening in early December, I stood in the empty second bedroom. The walls were bare, and the echo was sharp when I spoke aloud. Maybe I will rent it out, I mused. Maybe use it to help cover the mortgage. It was a practical thought, one that fit my nature. But I also smiled at the idea of having 2 bedrooms just for myself. One to turn into a library, or office, one to simply keep open. It was the kind of choice only people with options got to make, and for once I was one of them. As Christmas approached, the building lobby filled with wreaths and garlands, the smell of pine heavy in the air. I decorated the condo with a small tree set near the window so the lights could be seen from the street. I strung warm white lights along the balcony rail. Standing there, mug of cocoa in hand, I thought, this year will be different. I didn't know then how right I was, or how quickly the joy of that secret would collide with the expectations I had spent my whole life trying to escape. My parents had always been proud to tell people they raised their daughters with the belief that family came first. Frank would repeat it like a badge of honor whenever neighbors or friends asked how he managed to help both his girls. What he did not say out loud was that family first usually meant Julia second. I had lived in that role for as long as I could remember. Growing up in our house in Quincy, just outside Boston, I was the one who got straight A's and never asked for help. Rachel, 3 years younger, was the one who needed extra tutoring money for field trips, a car at 16. Dad called her the delicate one. Mom called her tender-hearted. To me, it meant they always stretched further to cover her while I was told I could manage on my own. When I went to Northeastern for undergrad, I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover my tuition and living expenses. At the same time, my parents were writing checks to cover Rachel's community college courses because they worried she would quit if she had too much stress. I never said anything. I believed the line they fed me that Rachel needed more, and I was strong enough to get through it. Even when I pursued my MBA at Boston University, I paid my own way with loans and years of working overtime. During those years, Rachel moved in and out of my parents' house, first with a boyfriend who did not last, then with Mark, who would become her husband. By the time I graduated and joined a financial firm downtown, they were married with their first child on the way. That is when the pattern of sacrifice really solidified. Family birthdays meant I bought the nicest gifts for my nieces and nephew because Mom said Rachel and Mark were just scraping by. When Mark's old Honda broke down, Dad suggested I chip in for the repair, and I did, cutting short a vacation I had saved for. If Rachel needed babysitting, I canceled my own plans. Nobody asked if I wanted to, it was presented as expected. I loved Emily, Noah, and Grace. They were sweet children, and they had no control over their parents' choices. That love made it harder to say no, and my parents knew it. They leaned on my affection for the kids to make me feel guilty if I ever hesitated. One conversation with Mom still echoes in my head. I had just finished paying off one of my graduate loans, a huge milestone. I called to share the news, hoping for congratulations. Instead, Martha sighed with relief and said, Julia, now maybe you can help Rachel with her mortgage since they are drowning. I remember sitting on my couch in my tiny rental, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, realizing she had not heard a word of my triumph. To her, my gain was only useful if it became Rachel's rescue. Dad was no different. He adored Rachel, the baby of the family. Whenever I visited, he fussed over her, asked about the kids, worried about her bills. With me, he asked about my job, but quickly turned it back to whether I could spare some help. One time, when Rachel's daycare bill was overdue, Dad looked me straight in the eye and said, "You are single, you have a good salary, it is only right you help." I wanted to scream, but instead I wrote the check. By the time Christmas of 2023 rolled around, this was the unspoken rule of our family dynamic. Julia can handle herself. Julia will step in. Julia does not need as much. Outwardly, we looked like a warm, supportive family. Friends admired how close we seemed. Inside, I carried the weight of resentment, though I rarely allowed myself to admit it. Sitting in my condo in Seaport with a little Christmas tree glowing in the corner, I thought about all of it. I thought about the years of being the reliable one, the safety net. I thought about Rachel, now 30, still leaning on our parents while juggling 3 children and a husband who could not hold steady work. And I thought about how my parents would view my new home not as the reward for my sacrifices, but as the solution to Rachel's problems. There had been other moments that made it clear where I stood. At Thanksgiving, just a month before, Martha had pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Rachel was stressed about rent," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the dining room. "You have always been so generous, Julia. Maybe you could let them stay with you for a while." I laughed it off then, saying my place was too small. It was at least the apartment I had at the time. Now, with a condo large enough for a family, I knew that same question would return, except this time it would not be a question. It would be presented as a decision already made. The hardest part was that they truly believed they were being fair. To them, supporting Rachel was the natural order. She had children, she had responsibilities. I had a good job, a degree, no husband, no kids. What did I need besides myself? That logic was woven so deeply into our family story that I sometimes caught myself repeating it. But when I walked through my condo and touched the keys in my pocket, I felt something stir inside me. Maybe for the first time I was ready to question that logic. Ready to stop carrying everyone else's weight. I kept these thoughts close, not sharing them with anyone but Taylor. Around my parents, I smiled, asked about the kids, and pretended nothing had changed. Around Rachel, I nodded when she vented about bills or groceries, but I did not offer solutions. It felt unnatural, like holding back a reflex. As the calendar edged toward Christmas Day, I knew the family dinner would be the true test. In my heart, I sensed the secret of my condo would not stay secret much longer. And when it came out, I would no longer be able to hide behind polite silence. Something was coming, something I had spent my whole life both dreading and preparing for, without even knowing it. Christmas Day dawned cold and clear, the kind of sharp December morning when the air seems to sting your lungs. I drove to my parents' house in Quincy with a pie balanced on the seat next to me and the radio playing carols. The streets were quiet, the kind of holiday calm where most families were already gathered around their tables. My stomach tightened as I turned into their driveway. The house looked the same as always, white siding with green shutters, wreath on the door, smoke curling from the chimney. I carried the pie inside, greeted by the smell of turkey and pine. Mom was bustling in the kitchen, flour on her apron, and Dad was fiddling with the television remote, trying to get the football game to come in clearly. I slipped off my coat and went to help Mom. She handed me a knife and pointed to a pile of carrots. I started chopping, the familiar rhythm of family duty. We made small talk about the weather, the pie, the decorations. For a while it felt almost normal. Then the front door opened, and Rachel's voice carried through the hallway. She came in with Mark behind her, juggling coats while the kids burst into the house with squeals. Emily darted to the tree, Noah chased after her, and little Grace clung to Rachel's leg until she spotted the plate of cookies on the counter. Mom wiped her hands and hurried out to greet them. I kept chopping, the sound of the knife against the cutting board steady, though my ears caught every word drifting from the living room. Rachel's tone was hushed but excited. I could hear her telling Mom and Dad that she had already started packing some boxes. My chest tightened. Dad's voice joined lower but clear enough in the old house with its thin walls. He said something about stability for the children and how Julia had space now. I froze, the knife hovering over the carrots. There it was, the words I had feared. Julia has space now. Mom's voice followed, warm and approving. That is how we raised her, to help family. She will understand. Rachel chimed in, a bright edge of relief in her tone. The condo will be perfect. Emily can have her own room, the little ones can share, and the school district is much better. Mark added a chuckle, saying something about saving money on rent so they could finally breathe. Their voices mixed together, cheerful, as if they were planning a vacation, not plotting to take over something I had bled 7 years to earn. I gripped the counter, my knuckles white. My heart pounded so hard I thought someone might hear it. I strained to listen as Mom asked Dad if they should help me move my things out to make room. Dad answered that I did not have much furniture anyway, always saving money instead of living. A laugh followed Rachel's, and then a comment about decorating. She said she had so many ideas for making the place look like a real home. Heat rose to my face. My condo was a real home. It was mine. Yet here, they were dividing the rooms, making plans, deciding without me. The kitchen felt small, suffocating. I forced myself to keep chopping the blade, hitting the board in sharp, even strikes. I tried to steady my breathing. I told myself to wait to see how they would bring it up to me. Soon we gathered around the long dining table, the turkey steaming, bowls of mashed potatoes and stuffing passed hand to hand. The kids laughed, Mom said grace, and for a brief moment it felt like every other Christmas. But the tension in my chest never eased. As plates were filled, Dad cleared his throat. He smiled at me, the kind of smile that carried an expectation. Julia, we have some wonderful news, he said. We think we have found the perfect solution for Rachel and the kids. I sipped my water, my eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Mom jumped in, her voice sweet. We know about your condo, sweetheart. Mrs. O'Brien from church mentioned she saw you in the seaport signing papers. We are so proud of you. Before I could respond, Rachel leaned forward, her eyes shining. And it is such perfect timing, Jules. With our rent going up and the kids' school being close, it makes sense for us to move into the other bedroom. Mark nodded beside her. We will be the best neighbors. Emily, sitting across from me, piped up with a big smile. Mom says I can walk to school from your new place, and you can help me with my math homework. My throat tightened. I smiled weakly at her, not wanting to crush the hope in her eyes. Around the table, everyone took that smile as agreement. The conversation rolled forward without me. Mom began planning who would help with moving. Rachel listed which furniture they would bring. Mark talked about giving notice to their landlord. Dad said how wonderful it was that everything was working out. I sat there nodding, occasionally pushing food around my plate, my appetite gone. Every word felt like a weight pressing on my chest. Not a single person asked what I wanted, what I had planned, what this condo meant to me. I looked around the table at the people I loved, my parents who raised me, my sister, who had always been the center, the children who trusted me. And I realized something had shifted. A line had been crossed. I lifted my glass, forcing a smile, pretending to toast along with everyone else, while inside my thoughts burned. They had already decided. To them, it was settled. But in my heart, I knew this time would not be like before. When the meal ended and plates were cleared, I helped Mom wash dishes, keeping my head down. Rachel chatted about paint colors, Mark about moving dates. I dried the last dish and set it on the rack. Driving back to my apartment that night, the roads empty and glittering with frost, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my hands hurt. Their voices replayed in my mind. Rachel's laugh, Mom's calm certainty, Dad's pride. My smile at the table had sealed it in their eyes, but in the quiet of my car I made a silent vow. This time I would not give in. This time I would not let them decide my future for me. The week after Christmas felt like I was living inside someone else's script. Phone calls from Mom came daily, not to ask, but to update. She told me she had started collecting boxes for Rachel. She asked if I wanted them stacked in my condo's storage area or in the living room until moving day. Dad left a message saying he would call a friend with a truck. Rachel texted me pictures of bunk beds she found online, asking which color would look better in the second bedroom. Each message landed like a stone in my stomach. I answered vaguely always, with a polite tone never revealing the truth simmering underneath. It was easier in the moment to nod along than to ignite a fire. Still, with every conversation I felt the walls close in tighter. On New Year's Eve, the family gathered again, this time at Rachel's place in Dorchester. Their apartment was small and crowded toys littered the floor, the air thick with the smell of lasagna. The kids were excited, running around in paper hats, blowing horns, and Rachel looked both frazzled and relieved. When the ball dropped on television, everyone cheered and she leaned in with a laugh. "Soon we will be in your condo, Jules," she said. Finally, some space. Mark raised his beer and grinned. "We can start moving as early as next weekend." He said it casually, like it was already agreed, like I had signed a contract. I smiled tightly, my throat dry. The sound of their confidence made me feel invisible. I excused myself to the kitchen, splashed water on my face, and stared at the reflection in the window. The fireworks outside sparkled against the glass, but inside me the celebration was hollow. A few days later, Mom invited me to dinner again. I almost said no, but guilt tugged me back. She served pot roast, the kind I grew up on, the smell of rosemary filling the kitchen. After dessert, Dad cleared his throat. "Julia, we need to make a plan for the move." He spoke as though it were logistics, not a decision. Rachel clapped her hands lightly and said the kids were already dreaming about their new rooms. I sat silent, my fork resting on the plate, listening as they discussed paint colors, curtains, and where to put the couch. Nobody turned to me, nobody asked if I was comfortable, if I wanted this. It was all spoken in tones of certainty, as if my only role was to smile and provide the key. When Mark mentioned breaking their lease at the end of January, I finally spoke. "That is soon," I said quietly. His head snapped toward me, eyebrows raised. "Of course," he replied, "it is the perfect time." The room went quiet, eyes on me. I forced a smile, swallowed hard, and nodded. I knew I had just confirmed their assumption once again. Driving home, my chest ached. I replayed the scene in my mind, my voice small and uncertain. I wanted to scream the truth, but instead I kept the peace. It was what I had done for decades. But as I pulled into the parking lot of my condo, the sight of the building lit against the night sky reminded me why I could not bend this time. I walked upstairs, unlocked my door, and stepped inside. The quiet hit me like a bomb. My tree still glowed in the corner lights, twinkling gently. I stood there, keys in hand, and let the silence fill me. This was mine. Every inch, every dollar, every late night at the office, every sacrifice had led me here. I sat on the couch and pulled out a notebook, the kind I used at work, to keep track of clients' finances. I began to write not numbers this time, but memories. The vacations canceled, the checks written, the nights babysitting. Each line sharpened the truth. I had given for years, and no one had noticed how much it cost me. The next morning, I poured coffee into my favorite mug and stared out at the harbor. The water was cold and gray, but the steady rhythm of the waves gave me clarity. I decided I would not confront them yet. Instead, I would make my move quietly on my own timeline. When Rachel texted again that afternoon with a link to a sofa she thought would fit perfectly in my condo, I typed back, still figuring out details, "I will let you know." She replied with a smiley face, and I set the phone down, my jaw tight. At work that week, I kept my focus on clients and numbers, but the background noise of my family's plans never left me. I knew a storm was coming. Each day that passed felt like a countdown, and each night, sitting in my condo with the city lights flickering beyond the glass, I promised myself I would be ready. I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook open, the pen poised over the page, and memories came faster than I could write them down. I remembered the summer of 2019 when I had finally saved enough for a trip to Florida. I had booked the flight, found a little hotel by the beach, and even bought new sandals. The week before I was supposed to leave, Rachel called crying that Mark's car had broken down. She said they did not have the money for repairs, and she did not know how he would get to work. I canceled the trip, lost the deposit, and wired her the money. Then there was the time I spent nearly every weekend babysitting so Rachel and Mark could have date nights. I loved the kids, I did, but I also knew those nights out for them were more like escapes from responsibility. I gave up dinners with friends, missed concerts, even skipped a coworker's wedding shower because Rachel called last minute begging me to come over. Christmas 3 years ago stood out the sharpest. My parents suggested I buy the expensive gaming console Emily wanted, since I did not have kids of my own to spend money on. I swallowed the sting and bought it, watching Rachel beam as if the gift came from her. Nobody said thank you. It was assumed. Julia can handle it. As I wrote each example, the list grew longer and uglier. Every time I had set aside my needs, my desires, my plans, so that Rachel could have what she wanted. Every time I convinced myself it was just one favor, just one sacrifice. But the truth was clear on the paper in front of me. It had never been just once. It had been a pattern, a role I had played so long I forgot I had a choice. The next evening, I called Taylor. My voice shook as I told her about Christmas dinner, about the whispers in the living room, about the way my parents and Rachel had mapped out my condo as if I were not even in the family photo. She listened quietly, and when I finished, her voice came sharp with outrage. "Jules, that is absurd. You worked for years for this. They cannot just decide it belongs to Rachel." I tried to argue, almost out of habit. They are family. Rachel has 3 kids. Maybe it would not be so bad. But Taylor cut me off. "Being family does not mean you let them take advantage of you. Would Rachel give you her house if the roles were reversed? You know the answer." Silence filled the line. My chest ached because she was right. Rachel would never. She never had. Taylor's tone softened. "If you let them move in, even for a month, you will never get them out. Your condo will stop being your home and turn into their lifeline. You deserve better." I pressed the phone to my ear, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. For once, someone was telling me I deserved better. That night, I made another list this time, not of sacrifices but of options. I could rent out the condo. I could live in a small apartment closer to my office. I could create boundaries in writing, not just in my head. The thought steadied me. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of control. Over the following days, Rachel's texts grew more confident. She sent me photos of curtains, of bunk beds, even of a new rug she thought would look great in what she called the kids' room. Mom left a voicemail saying she had measured the windows already and would bring over drapes. Dad asked if I needed help moving my furniture into storage to make space. Every message was another assumption stacked on top of me, crushing and absurd. I answered briefly, always delaying. "Still finalizing some things. Not quite ready. I will let you know." My vagueness gave me breathing room, though I knew the clock was ticking. At work, it became harder to concentrate. I would sit across from clients explaining retirement strategies or balancing portfolios while in the back of my mind, I heard Rachel's laugh. I saw the look on Dad's face when he said, "Julia has space now." My patience with everyone wore thin, though I forced a smile because that was the role I knew too well. One evening, I drove out to my parents' house for dinner. I told myself I would try to set a boundary, at least start the conversation. The kitchen smelled of garlic bread, and Rachel was already there, kids bouncing around the living room. She was animated, telling Mom how she had started boxing up the toys and labeling each carton. Emily chirped that she could not wait to decorate her new bedroom. I sat down at the table, the weight pressing down again. Between bites of pasta, Mark said they would give notice to their landlord by the end of the month. He grinned at me. That should line up perfectly right. My fork paused in midair. I wanted to say no, to shout that nothing was perfect, that I had never agreed. But everyone's eyes were on me, waiting for my nod. My voice came out small, tight. "We will see." Rachel clapped her hands. "That means yes," she said brightly. The kids cheered. Mom and Dad beamed with satisfaction. I forced a smile, my stomach twisting. After dinner, as I drove away, the weight of that false agreement sat heavy on my chest. I rolled down the window, the winter air stinging my face, trying to clear my head. By the time I reached my condo, the city lights glittered like tiny promises against the dark water. I parked, sat in the car, and whispered aloud, "No more. I will not let them steal this from me." Inside, I turned on the lamp by the couch and sat down with my notebook again. The page filled with reminders of the past, of who I had been, but this time I drew a line across the bottom. Under it, I wrote in bold, uneven letters, "This ends now." The words stared back at me, strong and defiant. I closed the notebook, my hands steady, and for the first time I believed them. The next morning, I called Taylor and asked if she had time for coffee after work. We met at a little cafe in Cambridge that we both liked, the kind of place with chipped wooden tables and strong espresso. I told her everything from the Christmas dinner to the list I had written to the way Rachel and my parents were making decisions as if I did not exist. Taylor listened. Her brows furrowed, her hands wrapped around her cup as though she was holding back a storm. When I finished, she leaned in. "Jules, you need to protect yourself now, not later. You know how these things go. If you wait, they will show up with boxes and children in tow. The only way to stop this is to make it impossible for them to move in." I stirred my coffee, though it had already gone cold. "What are you saying?" She held my eyes. "Rent the condo out. Both bedrooms if you can. Put everything under a management company so it is all legal and untouchable." The words hit me like a sudden wind. Renting both meant I would not live there myself. It meant stepping aside, at least for now. But the idea of losing my home to Rachel felt worse than the thought of waiting a little longer to enjoy it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, this time, researching property management companies in Boston. I read reviews, compared fees, and circled one name over and over: Harborstone Realty. Their ratings were solid, their reputation good, and they specialized in condos around Seaport. The following afternoon, I walked into their office, a modern space with clean white walls and shelves of neatly stacked binders. A man in his early 40s introduced himself as David Carter, one of their senior managers. He had a calm way of speaking, measured and professional, the kind of voice that settled nerves. I explained my situation in careful terms. I owned a 2-bedroom condo. I wanted tenants as soon as possible, and I needed airtight contracts. He nodded, taking notes, asking pointed questions about square footage, amenities, and location. When I told him the condo overlooked the harbor, his eyes lit slightly. "That will not be hard to place." We went through numbers together. Based on recent rentals in the area, he suggested I could charge $3,800 per month. My mortgage was a little over $5,000, so even with management fees, the rent from 2 tenants would cover most of the cost. It was more than I had dared to hope. I signed the paperwork that evening, my hands steady. David assured me they could begin showings within the week. Walking back to my car, the winter air biting at my cheeks, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, I had taken real action, not just scribbled promises in a notebook. That weekend, I invited Taylor over to see the condo one last time before the process started. We sat on the bare couch with takeout boxes between us, talking about paint colors and curtains I had never gotten around to buying. She squeezed my hand. "This is the right move. You are protecting yourself, not just reacting." I nodded, though a lump rose in my throat. The condo had been my dream for so long, and now I was letting strangers live in it. But when I pictured Rachel filling these rooms with toys and noise and bills that would never get paid, I knew I had chosen the lesser heartbreak. The next week was a blur of preparations. Harborstone sent a cleaning crew, replaced a leaky faucet, polished the hardwood floors. I walked through with David, checking every detail. He carried a clipboard marking notes, his professionalism steadying me. He reminded me that once leases were signed, my tenants had rights protected by Massachusetts law. No amount of family pressure could undo that. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed constantly. Rachel asked when she could measure the kids' bedrooms. Mom said she had already picked up curtains. Dad wanted to know what day we were renting a truck. I responded with vague messages, always promising to update them soon. One night, Rachel called instead of texting. Her voice was bright, too bright. Jules, the kids are so excited. Emily keeps talking about her new school. Noah wants to help paint. Grace picked out a unicorn poster for her wall. She laughed like we were sharing a secret. You do not know what this means to us. I stared at the ceiling, the phone pressed to my ear, guilt twisting in my gut. I made a non-committal sound and told her I had to get back to work. When I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, the city humming outside my window. By the end of the month, Harborstone had scheduled the first viewings. 2 couples and a retired woman were interested. I stayed out of sight, letting David handle the showings, though part of me wanted to peek in to see who might be walking across my hardwood floors. That Saturday night, I received an email from David with the subject line "Applications." 3 attachments, all strong candidates. My heart raced as I clicked through, reading their backgrounds. A doctor and nurse from Mass General. A retired professor from Boston College. A young tech couple working downtown. All of them financially solid with credit scores and references to prove it. I closed my laptop and pressed my palms together, breathing deeply. The pieces were falling into place faster than I expected. But the storm on the horizon had not disappeared. My family was still waiting, still packing, still assuming. And sooner or later they would collide head-on with the truth I had set in motion. Rachel's first text that Monday morning came before I had even left for the office. She had sent me 2 photos of children's bunk beds, one painted white and one navy blue, with the caption, "Which one do you think would look better in the second bedroom?" I stared at my phone, the coffee in my hand, turning cold, wondering how she could speak with such certainty about something that was not hers. By lunchtime, she had followed up with a picture of a rug patterned with stars and moons. Mom called around too, her voice full of excitement, telling me she had already bought drapes at Macy's for a steal and would bring them over this weekend. Dad left a voicemail after dinner saying he would ask a neighbor with a pickup truck to help us move my things into storage so Rachel and Mark could settle faster. Each message was another brick laid on a house they were building in their minds, one I had never agreed to. I responded the same way every time, with a vague delay. Still finalizing some things. Not quite ready yet. I will let you know, but I could feel the impatience growing. On Wednesday evening, while I was finishing paperwork at the office, Rachel called instead of texting. Her voice was eager, almost breathless. "Jules, we're giving notice to our landlord this week. He has been showing our place already. We need to know what day we can start moving boxes." I closed my eyes, the hum of the office fluorescent lights, loud in the silence. "I cannot give you a date yet," I said, forcing my tone steady. "Why not?" she shot back, confusion in her voice. "You said at Christmas it was fine." I rubbed my temple. "I never said yes." "You smiled," Rachel insisted. "You nodded. Everyone saw it. We thought that meant you agreed." Her words sliced through me. The false agreement I had let stand at the dinner table had turned into proof in her mind. Rachel's voice softened as if trying to coax me. "The kids are excited, Jules. Emily keeps talking about her own room. Noah's been sketching out where he'll put his toys. We already started packing their things. You don't know what this means to us." I swallowed hard, guilt pressing on my ribs. I told her I was still sorting out paperwork and hung up before my voice betrayed me. That night, I sat on my balcony, the cold wind biting at my skin, my phone buzzing with another message. This time it was Mark. "Hey, can you chip in for the moving truck? Money's tight this month, but I'll pay you back." I stared at the text in disbelief. Not only did they assume they were moving in, they expected me to fund the process. I put the phone down without answering, my hands trembling. The next morning at work, I thought I had escaped the family chatter, but gossip found its way into the office. One of my colleagues, Sandra, leaned over my cubicle with a smile that felt too sharp. "Heard your sister's moving into your new place. That's sweet of you. Not everyone would give up their own space like that." The heat rushed to my face. How did she even know? She said Rachel had mentioned it at church, that she was so thankful her sister had stepped up. I forced a laugh, brushed it off, but inside I burned. Rachel had not only told our parents, she had broadcasted it to the community, as if the deal was signed. When I left the office that evening, the city lights felt harsher than usual, the streets too loud. I drove straight to my condo, parked, and sat in the car with my hands gripping the wheel. They were closing in on me with words and assumptions and gossip, and if I did not act fast, they would box me into a corner I could never crawl out of. I went upstairs, dropped my bag, and stood in the empty second bedroom. The echo of my footsteps filled the space that Rachel had already claimed in her imagination. I pictured Emily taping posters on the wall, Rachel rearranging furniture, Mom hanging her bargain drapes, Dad telling me to be grateful I was helping. The image made me sick. My phone buzzed again. Rachel had sent another text, this one a Pinterest board full of decorating ideas labeled "Our New Home." I stared at the words until they blurred. I closed the phone, set it on the counter, and whispered to myself, "This isn't your home. Not now. Not ever." The sound of my own voice steadied me. The walls of the condo felt less like they were closing in and more like they were bracing me. It was my space, and I was not going to let them erase me from it. Still, as I curled up in bed that night, the guilt gnawed at me. The kids were innocent. They had no idea about contracts or boundaries. They only knew what Rachel told them. And Rachel was telling them a story where I was the generous aunt who had already said yes. Sleep came late, restless and uneasy, my dreams full of voices, calling my name, pulling me in every direction. When I woke the next morning, I knew the storm had only just begun. By Sunday morning, the pews at St. Andrews were buzzing long before the service began. I had not planned to go, but guilt tugged at me, the kind of guilt my mother had perfected instilling. I slipped into the back row, hoping to leave unnoticed. But whispers found me before the first hymn ended. Two women in front of me leaned together, one whispering that Rachel was lucky to have a sister like me. Another nodded, saying it was rare these days for people to sacrifice so much for family. My stomach dropped. Rachel had not just told a few friends. She had turned my condo into a story of her good fortune with me, cast as the willing benefactor. After communion, I stepped into the vestibule, pulling on my coat. Rachel appeared almost instantly, her hand warm on my arm, her smile wide. "Did you hear?" she said, her eyes shining. "Everyone is so happy for us." She said us like we were a team, like the condo belonged equally to both of us. I forced a tight smile. "What exactly have you been telling people?" Rachel tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Only the truth, that you offered us your place and saved us from a nightmare with our landlord." She lowered her voice but kept her smile, as if we were sharing a delightful secret. "People think it is so generous. Generous." The word felt like a chain around my throat. I pulled my arm free and walked outside into the sharp winter air. Snow flurries danced in the wind, but my chest burned. That afternoon I called Taylor. Her outrage was immediate. "She is framing this in public so you will be too ashamed to say no. That is manipulation, Jules." I pressed the phone against my cheek, watching the city skyline fade into dusk from my balcony. "I know," I said. "It feels like she is boxing me in from every side." "Then you need to build a wall she cannot climb," Taylor said firmly. "The leases, the contracts, the tenants. Once it is all signed, it is done." Her words steadied me, but the humiliation lingered. On Monday, at work, two colleagues stopped by my desk with cheerful comments about how wonderful I was for letting my sister move in. I smiled politely, my insides twisting, and buried myself in spreadsheets until my eyes blurred. By midweek, the gossip had spread beyond church. A neighbor in my parents' street stopped me at the grocery store to say she heard Rachel's children would be starting school near the harbor. I nodded stiffly and excused myself, abandoning half my cart to get outside where I could breathe. The following Friday, Rachel sent another text. This one included a photo of Emily standing in front of a stack of boxes labeled bedroom. The caption read "Countdown to moving day." I stared at it for a long time, my hands cold. It was as if she had already erased my presence from the condo, as if I were a placeholder in my own home. That night I met with David from Harborstone to finalize the tenant applications. He spread the files across his desk, methodical and calm. A retired professor from Boston College named Dr. Eleanor Walsh, a young couple, Brian and Lisa Torres, both medical staff at Mass General. Their credit was impeccable, their references solid. David looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "These are strong candidates. Are you ready to move forward? I signed my name without hesitation. The pen pressed heavy against the paper, the sound of ink scratching across contracts like a seal on my future. Walking home afterward, I passed by the harbor. The water slapped against the pilings, dark and restless. I thought about Rachel's smug smile in the church vestibule, about the women whispering praise for me, about the boxes already labeled with my rooms. I wrapped my coat tighter and whispered to myself that the story she was spinning was about to unravel. On Sunday, I skipped church. Instead, I sat in my condo with a mug of coffee, the contracts neatly stacked on the table. The city was quiet outside, snow drifting past the window. My phone buzzed again with Rachel's name. I did not open the message. I already knew what it would say. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the silence sink in. For the first time since Christmas, I felt a sliver of peace. The truth was locked in ink and paper now. Whatever Rachel told the world, reality was already shifting under her feet. The first lease was signed on a gray Tuesday afternoon. I left work early and met David at Harborstone's office. Dr. Eleanor Walsh arrived with a tidy folder of documents, her glasses perched low on her nose, her smile polite but reserved. She spoke of downsizing, of wanting to be near the harbor where she could walk each morning. I shook her hand, the paper crisp under our pens, and felt the weight of finality settle over me. 2 days later, the Torres couple signed for the second unit. Brian wore blue scrubs. Lisa carried a worn leather bag full of charts. They were warm and practical, thrilled to find a place so close to the hospital. When they thanked me, I swallowed hard, knowing they believed I had chosen them freely. The truth was harsher. They were my line of defense. That evening, I walked back into my condo, the contracts stacked in my bag, and stood by the window. The city lights stretched across the water, glittering and cold. For the first time since Christmas, I felt steady. My condo was no longer an open target. It was legally spoken for, shielded by signatures and dates that not even my parents could undo. But peace did not last long. On Saturday morning, Rachel showed up at my apartment without warning. She held Grace on her hip, Emily, and Noah trailing behind her. Boxes filled the trunk of her SUV, some stacked so high they pressed against the rear window. She breezed in without waiting for me to invite her, dropping her purse on the counter. The kids ran straight to the balcony, pressing their hands against the glass. Emily shouted that she had already picked out paint for her bedroom. Rachel set Grace down and turned to me with a bright, determined smile. "We can start today. Mark will be here in an hour with the rest of the boxes. Mom and Dad are right behind him." The words hit like a blow. I stood frozen, my mouth dry. Rachel mistook my silence for hesitation and clapped her hands. "I promise the kids will keep their toys tidy. We will make this place so warm." I finally found my voice low and steady. "Rachel, you cannot move in here." Her smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "Of course we can. Everyone knows. You nodded at Christmas. Mom and Dad already said yes." I shook my head. "I never agreed. The condo is not available." Her eyes narrowed, her face reddening. "Not available? What are you talking about?" I drew in a breath, my pulse pounding. "Both units are rented. Contracts are signed. People are moving in next week." Rachel stared at me, disbelief washing over her features. "You are lying." I pulled the contracts from my bag and laid them on the counter. Her eyes scanned the bold signatures, the dates. She picked up one page, her hand trembling. "You did this behind our backs." I steadied my gaze. "I did it to protect myself." Her voice rose sharp and furious. "You knew we were counting on this. The kids were counting on this. You let us pack, you let us plan." The children's voices drifted in from the balcony, muffled and cheerful. The sound twisted my heart. But I would not bend. I kept my tone calm. "I never told you to pack. I never promised you anything." Rachel's eyes filled with angry tears. "You are selfish. You have no husband, no children. You do not need this space." I clenched my fists at my sides, my voice tight. I worked for 7 years to save for this condo. I sacrificed vacations, weekends, every luxury. Do not stand here and tell me I do not need it. The front door opened then, and Mark walked in carrying a box. Mom and Dad followed close behind with bags of food, their faces expectant. When they saw the contracts on the counter, when they heard Rachel's choked voice, the room fell into stunned silence. Dad set the bag down slowly. "Julia, what is this?" Rachel answered for me, her voice shaking with fury. "She rented it out. To strangers. Behind our backs." Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me as if I had betrayed her. Dad's voice was low, hard. "Tell me, it is not true." I held their gaze, my throat dry, but my words steady. "It is true. Both units are leased. It is final." The weight of silence pressed down, broken only by Grace tugging on Rachel's sleeve, asking when she could see her new room. Rachel pulled her close, her face twisted in pain and anger. Dad's jaw clenched. "You would rather house strangers than your own family." I lifted my chin. "I would rather protect what I worked for than lose everything." The air was heavy with betrayal, disappointment, and fury. I stood my ground even as my heart ached. The truth had finally broken through, and there was no going back. Rachel's voice was the first to break the silence. She slammed the contract onto the counter so hard the paper curled at the edges. "You tricked us, Jules. You let us plan everything. You watched my kids get excited. How could you do this?" Mom stepped closer, her eyes wet and pleading. "Julia, honey, you could have told us. We could have figured out a compromise. Maybe Rachel could pay some rent, even if not the full amount. There had to be another way." I shook my head, feeling the weight of all their stares pressing against me. "I gave you no promises. You all made assumptions. And I am not breaking legal contracts because of assumptions." Dad's face darkened, his jaw tight. "You would put paperwork above family." The anger that had been simmering inside me for years surged. "Paperwork," I repeated, my voice rising. "Those contracts are the only thing keeping me safe. Every time I have helped, every time I have sacrificed, it has been brushed off as nothing. You ask for more, then more again. That stops now." Rachel's face twisted with disbelief. "We are family. That means something." I looked at her, at the woman who had leaned on me her whole life. "When has it ever meant something for you to sacrifice for me? When has anyone at this table asked what I needed?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, setting his box down, his eyes darting between us. "The kids," he muttered. "We have to think of the kids." I softened only for a moment, hearing Grace giggle faintly from the other room. "The kids deserve stability. But it is not my job to provide it." "That is your job, Rachel. Yours and Mark's." Rachel's eyes flashed, her cheeks blotchy red. "You make good money. You have no husband, no kids. What else are you going to do with it?" I felt my voice shake, not from weakness, but from fury. "I'm going to live my life. I am going to protect what I built, and I am going to stop being the person you drain dry every time something goes wrong." Mom reached for me, her hand trembling. "Please, Julia, think of Christmas, think of the children. We are a family." I stepped back, her touch hanging in the air. "I am thinking of Christmas. Do you remember the one where I bought Emily the gaming console because you told me I did not have kids to spend on? Or the one where I canceled my trip because Rachel needed money for car repairs? That was family too. Did anyone think of me then?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Dad slammed his hand on the counter, the sound cracking through the air. "Enough. If you want to turn your back on your blood, then fine. But do not expect us to forget this." Rachel's voice dropped low, venom curling around each word. "We will never forgive you." For a moment the room spun with the weight of their anger, of the children's laughter still drifting faintly from the balcony. Then David from Harborstone appeared at the door. He had arrived early for the final walkthrough with the tenants. His eyes flicked over the scene, the contracts on the counter, the bags of food, the tension crackling like static. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I straightened my shoulders. "Yes, David. My family was just leaving." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "This is not over, Jules." She gathered the kids, her movements sharp, her voice brittle as she told them plans had changed. Emily's face fell. Noah asked questions Rachel ignored, and Grace cried softly as Rachel carried her out the door. Mom and Dad followed, their silence heavier than shouting. Dad did not look at me. Mom's eyes lingered full of tears and disappointment before she stepped outside. Mark gave me a long look, something between anger and shame, then trailed after them with the box he had carried in. The door shut. The silence was immense. David adjusted his tie, setting his clipboard on the counter. "I am sorry you had to go through that," he said. "But it looks like everything is settled now." I nodded, my throat tight, my body trembling with the release of years of tension. Settled. The word felt both foreign and freeing. David opened his folder and began reading through the checklist for the tenants, his calm professionalism pulling me back to the present. I forced myself to focus, to listen, to nod when needed. But inside I felt a storm of grief, relief, and something sharp and unfamiliar. It was the taste of boundaries finally held. When David left, I sat at the table alone, the contracts still spread in front of me. Outside, the city lights blinked steadily across the harbor, as if reminding me the world kept turning. I pressed my palm flat on the papers, steadying myself. For the first time, I realized I had not lost my family. I had simply refused to lose myself, and that would have to be enough. The silence from my family came first like a relief, and then like a weight. For the first week after the confrontation, I heard nothing. No calls from Mom. No texts from Rachel, not even Dad's stern voicemails. My phone, once buzzing with their constant plans and instructions, stayed still on the counter. I told myself it was what I wanted, that peace was better than chaos. Yet at night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had gone too far. Taylor stopped by with takeout a few days later. She spread cartons of lo mein and sesame chicken across my coffee table and poured us both a glass of wine. She listened. As I admitted the guilt that was creeping in, how I could still see Grace's confused face when Rachel carried her out of my condo, how I could still hear Dad's voice calling me cold. Taylor set down her fork and looked straight at me. "Jules, you didn't betray them. You stopped betraying yourself." Her words soothed me, though the ache remained. At work, I buried myself in numbers and reports. I smiled when clients thanked me for their financial plans, but my mind wandered to Sunday dinners I no longer attended. I imagined my family at the table, my chair empty, Rachel, filling the silence with stories about how cruel I had been. One afternoon, as I walked home from the office, I saw Rachel across the street. She was leaving the grocery store with Emily and Noah tugging at her coat. For a moment, I thought she might ignore me, but Emily spotted me and waved. Rachel froze, then gave a stiff nod before hurrying the children into the car. The distance between us felt wider than the 4 lanes of traffic. Weeks passed and the tenants settled in. Dr. Walsh sent me a thank you note written in neat cursive telling me she loved watching the sunrise over the harbor each morning. Brian and Lisa invited me to stop by for coffee one Saturday, and I sat in what had once been my second bedroom, now filled with their plants and laughter, and realized it no longer felt like a loss. It felt like protection. Then in late February, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was addressed in Mom's handwriting, careful and slanted. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside were 4 pages written on lined paper. She began by saying she had been hurt that Christmas had not been what she hoped for, but that time had given her perspective. She admitted they had leaned on me too much, expected too much, and never stopped to see how it affected me. She wrote that Dad was still angry, but even he had started to realize they might have pushed me past a breaking point. She ended with an invitation. "We would love to see you at Sunday dinner," she wrote. "No pressure, just come if you want to." I folded the letter carefully and sat staring at it for a long time. The ache in my chest loosened, replaced by something fragile and tender. For so long I had wanted acknowledgement, even just a sliver of understanding. Here it was in ink on paper. That Sunday I drove back to Quincy, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my stomach in knots. The house looked the same, the wreath on the door still faded from Christmas. When Mom opened the door, her eyes filled with tears, and she pulled me into a hug before I could say a word. I held on longer than I meant to feeling the familiar warmth and the strangeness of distance all at once. Dinner was quieter than before. Rachel and her family were not there, which was both a relief and a sadness. Dad kept his eyes on his plate at first, but as the meal went on, he asked about my job, my condo, even my tenants. His voice was gruff, but there was something new in it, a kind of respect I had not heard before. As I drove home that night, the city lights glimmering ahead of me, I felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but on the path. For the first time, I was not just surviving my family. I was teaching them who I really was. And I knew the hardest chapter facing Rachel again still waited for me. It was early March when Rachel finally called. The screen lit up with her name, and for a long moment I just stared at it, my thumb hovering. Part of me wanted to let it ring out to stay in the safety of silence, but something in me knew it was time. I answered, my voice steady. She did not waste words. "We need to talk." Her tone was clipped but not quite as sharp as before. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Milton, halfway between her place and mine. I arrived first, sliding into a booth by the window. My stomach twisted as I watched cars pull in, but when she walked through the door, she looked less like the furious sister who had stormed out of my condo and more like a woman carrying too much weight. Her coat hung loose, her hair pulled back hastily. She set her bag down and sat across from me without a smile. For a while, we just stirred our coffee. Finally, she spoke, her eyes fixed on the table. "You hurt me. You hurt the kids. They thought they had a home waiting and then it disappeared." I swallowed hard. "I never promised it to you, Rachel. You assumed. Mom and Dad assumed. And I stayed quiet too long, which made you think I agreed. That was my mistake. But it was never yours to take." Her lips pressed together, her hands tightening on her mug. "Do you know how desperate we were? Mark lost work, rent went up, bills piled higher every month. I thought for once I had a way out, and it felt like you slammed the door shut." I leaned forward, my voice softer now. "I know things have been hard. But Rachel, I spent years sacrificing for you. Every time something went wrong, I fixed it, and you never once asked what it cost me. That condo was my dream, my security, my future. I could not give it up, not even for you." Her eyes flicked up, wet but steady. "You think I do not feel guilty? The kids heard people at church saying how generous you were. I had already told them we would move. I thought if I admitted you never agreed, I would look like a fool." The honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, her words were stripped of entitlement. She sounded small, even vulnerable. I reached for my coffee, the steam curling between us. "Rachel, I do not want you to fail. I want you to figure things out without leaning on me. I want you to stand on your own." She let out a shaky laugh, part bitterness, part surrender. "You sound like Mom." "No," I said firmly. "Mom would have handed you the keys. I am telling you to take responsibility." We sat in silence for a long time. The noise of the cafe filled the space between us, cups clinking, conversations humming. Then Rachel sighed long and heavy. "We found a smaller apartment. It is not what we wanted, but we can afford it. Mark picked up shifts at the warehouse. It is tight, but we are managing." A weight I had carried for months eased slightly. "I am glad," I said. "Really?" She nodded, her eyes softer than they had been in years. "I do not know if I can ever forgive you completely." I met her gaze. "You do not have to forgive me today. Just understand why I did it." We left it there, unfinished but lighter. Outside, the air was sharp with the promise of spring. Rachel hugged her coat around herself and walked to her car. I watched her go, unsure if we had mended anything or just accepted the cracks. The months that followed brought quiet shifts. Mom still called, though less often, and her tone carried more respect than instruction. Dad softened, too, even asking my advice on his retirement accounts, a question that once would have gone to anyone but me. Rachel and I were not close, but she sent photos of the kids now and then, small gestures that felt like olive branches. Meanwhile, the condo became what I had dreamed it would be. Rent checks arrived on time, Harborstones sent neat reports, and the building grew alive with the lives of my tenants. Dr. Walsh invited me for tea one Saturday, showing me the roses she had planted on the balcony. The Torres couple filled their place with warmth and laughter, their music drifting faintly through the walls when I visited. One evening, sitting in my own apartment with the harbor lights flickering outside, I realized something. The condo had started as a dream of ownership, but it had become a lesson in boundaries. By saying no, I had not just saved my property. I had saved myself. Looking back, I do not regret the fight. It tore open wounds, but it forced all of us to grow. Rachel learned she could survive without me as a crutch. My parents learned I was not theirs to command. And I learned that family love does not mean endless sacrifice. It means respect even when it is hard-won. If you have ever had to draw a line with your family, you know how heavy it feels at first, like you are breaking something sacred. But sometimes saying no is the only way to protect what is sacred inside yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it struck a chord with you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up against family expectations? Please share. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one.